Well, today I am with Dr. Matthew Jones. Awesome dude. We've connected in the past. By way of introduction from other entrepreneurs that have worked with him, he's an executive psychologist and coach to entrepreneurs. He's worked with founders from, companies backed by all the big names, the YCs, Koyas, Andreessen Horowitz, and so on. He's mastered many things, including helping co-founding teams improve their communication, teamwork, and decision-making. He's developed his own approach, which he calls the co-founder clarity coaching method, which I'm going to ask a lot of questions about that. It's a unique blend of what he calls depth-oriented therapy and results-oriented coaching, where he teaches entrepreneurs the skills and frameworks needed to build a resilient leadership culture rooted in trust, self-awareness, and integrity. So Dr. Jones, thank you for joining me and spending time.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Let's just start with the fundamentals of what is co-founder coaching and how is the field developing and what does it mean from your perspective?
So co-founder coaching is an emerging field. It's something that back whenever I was getting started 5 years ago, I didn't really know existed. I've since come to know about 20 other people who are doing this work globally, and it's going to continue growing. But fundamentally, it's paying attention to the founding team, their dynamics, their communication, their decision-making, and trying to help strengthen it so that it can be resilient to external stresses. It can continue scaling as the company grows, and it can offer that sense of support and companionship that's much needed on this entrepreneurial journey.
Gotcha. And from my personal experience, having worked at a bunch of early stage startups, I somewhat joke that I was 4 for 4 in terms of I worked at 4 startups, and in all 4 cases, there was a massive amount of sort of co-founder churn and turnover that also sort of propagated through the executive layers of the company. So from my vantage point, I think from many others, it seems like the status quo is that there is going to be conflict amongst founders, no matter what the situation is. From your experience, is that more consistent with what you've observed and what's true? And if conflict is the norm, I'd love to hear your take on what sits at the root of why that's the norm.
Sure. So I 100% agree. Conflict is inevitable. And the thing that I often tell founders whenever I'm working with them is that the difference between those high-performing teams and everyone else is not an absence of conflict. It's actually that the high-performing teams have learned to navigate that conflict more effectively. And I think inherent in every disagreement is an opportunity for growth. There's an opportunity to learn more about how your partner or partners thinks, to update your internal model of them and how they make decisions, what's impacting them personally, professionally. There's an opportunity for you to be more explicit and level up your leadership, your communication style. And there's an opportunity for the team to deepen the level of trust and commitment in working together. And so part of what's fascinating to me is to think about the fact that actually it's the avoidance of conflict that leads to even worse outcomes for a lot of teams. And I think Noam Wasserman's research, who wrote The Founder's Dilemmas, speaks to this actually. It's actually the avoidance of conflict that leads to all these problems. And I think about things like related fields, such as marital therapy, where Dr. Gottman and some of the research that the Gottman Institute has done has shown that 70% of recurring disagreements in marital couples are perpetual problems, meaning just differences from personality alignments, values, these kinds of things. And I think that there's a lot of similarities there, where with your co-founders, because you're different human beings who have different preferences, there's inevitable mismatch. And so really, even if you have like the perfect co-founding team where the personalities are a great mix, they have diverse skill sets and a lot of different resources to pool together, there's still going to be conflict, especially if you're trying to grow a company and do so successfully.
So it's not necessarily that the root of the conflict is these are different people with different approaches and maybe even different backgrounds that sort of shape how they react in certain situations, but that when conflict arises, the default response is, I feel like I'm on the verge of some tension with this person, but I don't want to approach it.
I think that's getting close to it. So like, let me explain to you a model that I use to simplify this process. And then it gives us like a new way of talking about it. So often what I see whenever people come in to my digital office is, these complaints and these thoughts about bad intent, that conflict is happening because Joe over here is being selfish or not really thinking about the company in the way that I need him to, or something to this effect. And the truth is, most miscommunication and conflict is not due to bad intent. It's actually due to speaking different languages. And there's 3 different languages that I see teams speak, and they often do this unconsciously. And so part of my job as a coach is to point these out, add a bit more shared language and understanding so that we can dissect this in a different way. And those 3 languages are the operational, the psychological, and the archetypal. The operational language is just the default setting of most teams. So this is the quick, rational decision-making process. This is how you're getting business done. It doesn't take much effort. This is like, again, kind of just the way of doing business together. The psychological language is more the language of emotion. It requires a completely different mindset to the business operations and different skills. It involves slowing down, being more present, being much more deliberate about trying to help one another feel understood, trying to empathize, and therefore it's a lot more demanding, psychologically, mentally, emotionally. It takes more resources to do this effectively. And then the last language, the archetypal language, is the language of the unconscious. And this is like what psychoanalysts talk about as the relational field or intersubjectivity. This is what the young kids call the vibe, right? The vibe's on, the vibe's off. It's good, it's bad. And so there's this unconscious to unconscious communication. And just to like say it in a different way, whenever you and your partner are working really well together, there's kind of like a synergy, right? It's like 1 + 1 = 5. You can just feel like, okay, we're clicking, we're moving forward. There's this beautiful thing that's happening. And on the flip side, whenever things are blocked and not going well, there might be that feeling of anxiety of, ooh, I'm walking on eggshells. Ooh, I don't want to bring that conflict up or that topic up. It's not going to go well. Or kind of just like this, dull energy suck that you don't want to continue meeting with this person. You're not looking forward to coming into the office. And so these are all forms of communication. And so as a coach, my job is to help teams understand, first off, that it's not bad intent. And second off, that there's something else going on interpersonally that's actually the root cause. So I would go as far as saying that the core cause of co-founder conflict is an unspoken emotional dynamic in the partnership that's not yet being named, addressed, and worked through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that leap, getting somebody to understand this isn't ill intent, because at the end of the day, I guess if you're sitting across the table from someone and you think that they don't have the best interests of you or your company in mind, you probably don't give a damn what they say. Right? That's sort of a filter that everything passes through. So can you share some examples or talk through how you help people get over that gap of understanding that ill intent is not at the root of this?
Sure. So even this lens that you just articulated, which I think is a very clear way of saying it, is called what like the Gottman Institute talks about as negative sentiment override, which just means that you are more likely to interpret a neutral or a positive statement by your partner as something that is negative. And so a lot of teams will come to me in this kind of state because they have low trust, because they have less vulnerability. And so a big part of actually rebuilding and repairing, this kind of core concept of the other person and not continuing that process of making attribution bias, that's actually more of a byproduct of the work. So if we focus more on improving the language, building shared skills, helping each person feel understood, then what will naturally start to happen is more vulnerability, more trust, more risk taking. And then that will foster more of a connection where then they can actually start to talk about the stories in their head and noticing how those are different than what the other person's sharing.
So in this process too, like how important is it that each person becomes familiar with their archetype? And how does that archetype fit in? So for example, through the work that I've done with one specific healer in the past, it became very, very clear that for whatever reason, I have the hero archetype. It even presents itself in nearly every single one of my dreams, which feel more like nightmares, where the exact circumstances of the dream can always change, but the metaphor is always the same, where I was trying to save everybody and I couldn't. but I refused to give up. And so it was like through the subconscious exploration via dream analysis and then looking at all the rest of my behaviors outside of the dream state, where then this archetype became clear. And then that sort of helped me, where I realized like, oh shit, yeah, here I am trying to save everything and save everyone. And that's just emptying my gas tank and leading to all sorts of negative side effects. So I'm curious, like how important is it that each individual understands their archetype, and what is the process through which you guide somebody towards that?
I would love it if every person understood their archetype or their myth that they're living, or alternatively, kind of their personality structure. We live in a world where it requires some investment and some self-awareness and like really doing a lot of personal work to get to that point. Just as an aside, I'm working on a book on co-founder conflict and kind of talk about its impact and these other things. The second book I want to work on is exactly what you're talking about. It's more about archetype. It's more about personality styles and dynamics, and then kind of using all the tools and frameworks that I already have to put those pieces together, because it is a little bit more advanced. But I will say, to your point, I love it whenever teams have that degree of awareness and they can speak to some of those differences. And this is where a lot of coaches will use Enneagram, MBTI, or other types of things, because what you're really doing at a high level is you're creating shared language and shared understanding to talk about differences. And so if you're aware of your archetype or your, various profiles, then you have a new lens to talk about what's getting in the way of effective communication and figure out where to best connect. And so the way that I do that is actually a little bit more informally. I might notice some of the patterns that someone's coming in. So if I notice someone's playing the hero role over and over again and maybe like trying to rescue their partner from experiencing vulnerability or discomfort, I might point that out, and I might actually encourage you not to rescue this other person, to let them sit a little bit more, because perhaps their depth needs to emerge into the partnership for there to be a repair of trust. So I do some of this stuff, but a little bit more informally as opposed to the formal route, but there's merits to both.
I see. And then, so continuing with that scenario, let's say, Andy is a co-founder. He's got this hero complex about him. Who knows where it came from, but it's there, and it's presenting itself in the co-founder relationship. It is the goal then for me. First, it's clearly, I should develop some understanding and awareness of that. It's also then helpful for my co-founder to say, okay, Andy's default mode is to act and behave in this way because of this hero archetype. It sounds to me then that the goal is to recognize and then occasionally intervene to sort of subdue it in a sense, but not to say, let's make a fundamental change to this person's archetype because it's annoying.
Right. So to say this in a slightly different way, again, in terms of co-founder coaching, my job is not to focus on either individual. It's to focus on the system that the two of you are creating. And so in this case, yes, this can involve some individual work. And for you, it's actually on both sides making a micro adjustment in how you're communicating and how you're thinking. So for you, then in the hero role, I would encourage you perhaps use that to your strength in certain moments, but in others where it's interfering with the, building of trust or creating the type of environment that you two need to level up your communication and make it even more effective. So insofar as that's creating an impingement, then that's where I would encourage you, okay, actually, Andy, why don't you intentionally hold back a little bit since that is your default, and instead let Mark over here have a little bit more of a say initially. And then after Mark's kind of flushed out his idea and you've helped him do that, then maybe is the time to bring in, okay, now let me put the team on it back. Here's what I'm thinking. And so it's encouraging both of you to do something different. Mark, in this case, I would be encouraging to be more active initially, sharing more of his thoughts, which could be a challenge for him and his archetype and his personality style. So it's kind of a both and.
Gotcha. Okay. And then building on what you mentioned around there's individual work, but the coaching sits at the center of the relationship. So then how do you describe or think about the role of coaching versus individual therapy and how those two things fit together for an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so there's so many different ways to talk about and think about this, but I'll just tell you, in the teams that I've seen that are well-resourced, that really value their personal health and well-being, what I've seen them do is kind of have a full committee. And so they'll see me for co-founder coaching where I'm focused on their relationship and deepening that. Then they will also have individual therapists where they're able to talk about some of the different challenges that are influencing, the relationship, them personally. And so kind of more on that personal side of things, but a little bit into the work stuff, because as an entrepreneur, there's so much overlap between work and professional life. And then they might even have an executive coach focused just on their leadership development. And so they might meet a little bit less frequently, but that's just exclusively how am I leveling up my management, my leadership, all of those kinds of things, a little bit more in isolation, a little bit more process kind of a thing. And then they'll also have a peer group. So a group of peers where they can run by various issues and feel a great sense of support and grounding. And so that can be like a beautiful way to really accelerate your personal growth and development. And so I think that they can be complementary, because as a coach and working on the co-founding team, again, my job's on the system. And so there may be instances where, let's just continue with the hypothetical. I'm like, okay, Andy, it seems like this hero complex, you've talked about it a bit. It's showing up in these ways. Here's some of the adjustments. And so then you can actually take that to your therapist and be like, okay, now I'm going to talk about where this comes from in even more detail and like really flush it out and like try to like do the work around grieving that, letting that go. All of those kinds of things can happen in your individual therapy. Whereas in the coaching, it's just going to be more so of being aware of it and then making some adjustments based on it.
Yeah. So you're not sitting there in a coaching session with two co-founders saying, Andy, tell me about your mom, right? That may be happening more, call it in the psychoanalytic, like looking backwards framing that can be common in an individual therapy setting in order to understand how prior events may have culminated in present mood, thoughts, behavior. And then in the coaching experience, it's like, let's assess what is happening right now, certainly through the lens of kind of speaking past each other, like two ships sailing by each other in the night sort of thing. And then bring them into that moment and understand, like, here's how you're sort of speaking past each other, but let's resolve that.
Well said. Yeah. And so I guess to your point, it depends on the team. So most often it is like people will come to me because they're having a recurring business disagreement, let's say. And anytime there's a recurring business disagreement, that's where they're stuck. They're actually arguing about that unspoken emotional issue, but they're using operational language. And so part of getting them unstuck is getting into a little bit more depth. And so it may involve them sharing, oh, this is what's coming up for me. This is why I'm thinking this way, And so it does go into maybe even naming some of these patterns that are deeper to your point. But we're not going to necessarily work at those level of depths and really go back historical. My thing is, I see the pattern. I know it's there. I know it came from somewhere, but I don't necessarily need to like call that out and be like, oh, this is a mom issue. I could leave that to the individual therapist and more so work with the live pattern as they're happening.
Gotcha. I would imagine that there are, call it common forms or subtypes of conflict. So if there's this overarching explanation, which is you're thinking and talking in operational language, it's actually something that's more at the level of emotion and language. But are there common forms of conflict that you tend to see? For example, you said, reoccurring forms that pop up. Like I could imagine there's conflict is accentuated at certain periods, like fundraising, major milestone and roadmap planning, the sort of like, what are the categories that you see where these conflicts tend to fall into?
There's several different categories. Let me see if I can try to walk through most of them. And so I'll start at a high level and then we can get more granular. So just general topics, hiring and firing, roles and responsibilities, equity and compensation, to your point, high growth or fundraising, and then, vision and strategic alignment. Those are like very broad categories. Another set of broad categories are, those other milestones. So I see a lot of conflict, sometimes for teams very early, like pre-seed, seed. And a lot of my work's actually around the series A and B, because this is where, there's a lot more challenges that are emerging with the scaling and before some potential exits that might happen a little bit later on. And so I think that those can be all really intense time periods where some of the pressures are turned up, where more of these conflicts show up. And this makes me think of something that's kind of interesting. I've heard the phrase a lot that, growth solves all problems or something to that effect. And I can guarantee you this, it's not true in this domain because actually the cracks in the foundation get even worse under growth.
It's a really important message because, there came a point in my career where I realized like I needed to take somewhat of like a Buddhist approach to non-resistance and acceptance. Because if the startup is growing fast, everything's going to be broken and things will continue to break. This is especially true for network-driven startups typically. So, these social media companies, marketplaces, whatever, these sort of companies tend to grow the fastest because when the network effect kicks in, it like pulls the business forward faster than you're prepared to handle it. Versus non-network effect businesses, they tend to be closer to linear growth as opposed to exponential. So in other words, some business types grow faster than others. And sure, maybe this hypergrowth solves some problems, like makes fundraising easier, improves the terms of fundraising, maybe attracts higher quality talent through the network because they see this hypergrowth company is creating, to your point, all these cracks in the infrastructure, and it's growing so fast that you don't even have the time to solve those. And in many cases, you have to just say, all this shit over here is broken and we just cannot fix it for now. We'll get back to that in like 3 years. I wanted to share that because that was an observation I had through my career. And like one of the things that really helped me was just arriving at this point of basically being able to smile and laugh about it and be like, yeah, it's all broken. And that's actually just the natural state of things for this type of growth.
Yeah. I think part of what's so interesting is, to your point, it gets harder and harder to prioritize making time to have these deeper emotional conversations with your co-founder and to spend quality time with them outside of work and to like enjoy the relationship. It just all goes to the wayside, and understandably so. But part of what I've seen that's really helpful to teams who are successful in pushing back against all these challenges and maintaining their resilience and connection is having some type of ritual where they do check in with one another, sure, but also about the relationship. Because the truth is the relationship must evolve and scale along with the organization, or there's going to be a gap that's too wide to, cross. And so I think that having those co-founder syncs or those date nights or whatever the case may be, to really get on the same page, realign, reconnect, talk about the challenges, give each other feedback. Some of those structures are, of incredible value.
Yeah, I can really see the parallel to marriage and family counseling in that sense. The parents are working and then a kid or two comes along and all of a sudden quality time together, the date nights, these shared opportunities to reconnect and decompress, like those go by the wayside. And you have to establish a ritual in which that is maintained. That makes a ton of sense. What do you offer suggestions, or have you seen really good examples of what this sort of, sustained ritual around co-founder bonding, like what that looks like?
It looks different for different teams. And, this is something that inevitably will come up in the course of our work together, because it is so important. Because to your point, like just to make it more personal and make this make sense, I have a 1.5-year-old and I have a second child on the way. And what I've noticed is with less time focused on my partner and the marriage, the relationship has felt more transactional and more operational, right? It's like we're focused on child rearing, on driving to and from school, getting all the meal prepped, right? And so it feels like on one hand, this is great collaboration and we're doing these things, but I also am aware that if we don't prioritize making time just for us to connect, then what's actually going to show up are more of these difficult moments where, I dressed the child in some ridiculous outfit that my wife's like, no, she could never go to school like this, or whatever the case may be. And so those negative interactions start to really pile up and there's less positive, energy going to this bank account. And so it then gets a little bit wonky where then all of our interactions are transactional or negative or frustrating in some way. And there's not enough positivity and connection coming back. And so that's why you have to prioritize it in the marriage, but the same goes with the co-founding team. And so part of what I've seen some people do dinners on like a regular cadence, whether that's monthly or every few months, every quarter, whatever the case may be. I've seen teams who like to go on walks together on it with the purpose of checking in and having a different conversation than they would typically, or, doing more often, some type of retreat or some leadership development and doing those things together. So there's many different ways to do it. I kind of differentiate between co-founder syncs and co-founder dates. Co-founder syncs are more of like, throughout the week, can be less time, but more so on the business operational side of things and really just making sure you're on the same page and both of you are understanding where things are at. So status updates, these kinds of things. In those, I recommend you can sometimes like flag an issue, like, okay, this is one I want to add to our agenda for this longer conversation that we'll have. And so then with this longer co-founders conversation, the date, this is what got me called State of the Union. That's whenever you're going to walk in, you're going to do a little check-in about how you're each feeling emotionally. And then you're going to open up and say, okay, how are we doing? Are there pieces of feedback we need to give each other? Are there different challenges that are coming up for us? And then kind of working through more of that and then making sure to close with a little checkout. So creating that sense of container and containment, I think is really important for teams. So whether that's, in that formal structure that I just mentioned or kind of while you're doing something you enjoy, I think those are some of the helpful things that I see.
I'm curious about thoughts around rituals for co-founders to conclude a painful or ugly experience. When I chat with some folks, I chatted with an entrepreneur a couple of weeks ago who had to depart his company, not necessarily on his terms. It was succeeding and doing well, but ended up having to step away. And what I said to him, I was like, have you had your Office Space printer moment? And he's like, what do you mean? And, recalling the movie Office Space, if you haven't seen it, please see it. And maybe that's a good date night for a couple co-founders is like, chips, watch Office Space, have a beer or smoke a joint, whatever it is, right? But the reason I said this is because I could tell he was still harboring pain from the bit of the heartbreak. And I said, I was like, have you had your printer moment where, if they steal the printer from the office, they take it out to a field and beat the shit out of it and destroy it. But it's this sort of cathartic cleansing and turning of the page, so to speak. Do you see those rituals as well? Is that something that's less common, but that you would recommend?
Definitely less common. I'm a huge fan of rituals. As I'm listening to you talk about this, I'm realizing this actually has not come up in kind of like a formal ritual sense. And I would actually love to think more about this and have more teams experiment with it. I do focus on structure, right? And so I will help teams create for them a type of structure that works well, that gives them that sense of containment where, okay, now that we've had this conversation, we're able to close it. And this is a sign of health, by the way, is this kind of flexibility to be able to say, oh, this was a really painful, really difficult conversation where we were brutally honest and it hurt, but I'm also leaving feeling a little bit more understood. And like I have a kind of an action item, something that I can take and move forward with. And therefore I'm able to leave this and now get back to work. And we're going to be able to go and have this investor call in 5 minutes and we're going to be okay. And so I tend to focus on that and less on some of these more concrete rituals. But I love the idea.
Yeah, because, in our day-to-day life or just in culture in general, we have rituals around birth and death, creation, destruction, sort of, the bookends, the open and close. And I actually think that it was interesting when I mentioned it to him, I saw this huge grin and what was otherwise sort of like this weight. He had this heaviness about him for the first 20, 30 minutes of our chat. And then all of a sudden I saw him realize like, yeah, actually, I want to take a baseball bat to something. Right? And he was excited of like, yeah, I'm going to get this shit out of me. Right? So I don't know what he's done since then. I hope he's gone on and found his printer to smash, whatever form that is. And I learned that from another friend who's a coach who at one point was, before becoming a coach, was thinking about, starting a venture arm and these other initiatives only to realize like, no, that wasn't the path I want to go down. And so one of the things that he did was literally take the contract he had drawn up that would have established what he was doing next. And he burnt the thing. He just burned it and said, no, I have washed my hands of this. I'm not doing it. So anyhow, for the entrepreneurs that are listening, like if you feel an unresolved closing to something that was not a pleasant experience, that would be one of my suggestions. Find the printer, whatever that may be, and dispatch of it.
100%. And, and a lot of this can be done individually, right? So like sometimes I'll be working with teams and I was talking to a client the other day who he was exercising and he would use that as kind of a fuel to like get frustration out and that kind of a thing. And so there's ways to consciously engage exercise and other things. Another thing that he and I created was kind of what he would call rage journaling. So dumping all of those thoughts, all of that negativity, all of that frustration, and then, either burning it, throwing it away. It depends on if you're a typer or a writer. But I 100% agree with this idea of creating some sort of symbolic concrete ritual to close something so that then you can start fresh.
You hinted at it, but like company grows and it's not that growth solves all problems and then all of a sudden conflict and everything else goes away. But like you've not only observed the types of conditions, say fundraising, in which conflict tends to emerge, are there also similar patterns around the types of conflict that show up at different life stages of the company?
So generally, yes. I, again, tend to oversimplify and just talk about both the different languages because like at the root, right, it's never about just the business disagreement, right? So as an example, I'm working with this team for quite some time. And last year they were in argument about cost of living increases and whether or not to do that with their company, given the fact that there's kind of some macroeconomic circumstances that are unique. And so that's what they were arguing about. But why they weren't able to move forward is because they were actually arguing about who has power over this decision. And is it mine? Is it yours? And, how do we figure that out? And so there are these deeper dynamics about like power and control and, respect and feeling recognized and appreciated for your contribution. Or kind of another team I'm working with, the main issue is actually a degree of closeness. One wants to be much closer and more friends than the other one who wants work-life separation. And so those are really those deeper conflicts that show up. And so, yes, there's like similar, like for example, as you continue expanding your team, more of that imposter syndrome, that transition from IC to management, all of that will bring up different dynamics and challenges. But really at the core, it goes a little bit deeper to some of these other areas. And those are the real patterns that I see.
What's the solution? If I could ask such a basic question to the scenario, the power dynamics. There's situations, of course, where you have equal ownership founders, but then you have founders, co-founders, where one is superior in terms of equity ownership versus the other. Like who does make that decision and how do you arrive at coming to that conclusion?
Yeah, I'm going to take a scenic route here. So if I do not answer the question, please hold me accountable. So I hear a lot of conversation in this space, especially from VCs, about making sure that someone has final say. And I think it's pointing the right direction, but it's kind of missing the point. The point is in the process of discovering who's going to have final say over what call and what circumstance, that's the conversation that needs to take place. That's like the interpersonal skills that actually need to be developed for that who has final say to be effective. If you and I are working together and we're just like, you have final say, but we don't talk about it, then it's not going to be an effective agreement. If we don't sort through those issues and I can't tell you, hey, I feel very frustrated because I also feel like I'm bringing stuff to the table. And here's some of the ways that I'm thinking about it. And so it kind of misses the mark and it oversimplifies this process. So part of what I think is really important as I'm working with teams to figure out some of these power issues is first being able to name that that's actually what's happening. And having, again, the shared scaffolding of language, of understanding to be able to get to that point and to talk about it directly. And as we're able to talk about it directly and help each individual feel understood, often with power, there is that misattribution of intent. And so I'm working with a team right now. They're actually more early stage. There's a big power issue between one founder who has a bit more experience and was a previous kind of higher up at a previous firm that they were working at. And then these two other individuals who were more or less his direct reports. And so now they're all equal in some kind of sense, but also not because they're coming in with this pre-existing power structure. And so the other two individuals have some concern about like, is he actually thinking about all of us? Is he putting the best interest of the company or is he wanting to be out in front and kind of get all that recognition? And so actually, as we've had the conversation, he's able to share, no, in fact, I really do care about you. I want you guys up there with me. I still want to have a little bit of the final say in some of these different calls because I feel like I'm, et cetera. Like we can get more into those details. But as they're able to have that conversation, there's something that begins to heal and to take shape to where each person can better understand how the parts fit together. And so it's never as simple as who is the equity, who said they were going to have final say or anything like that. It's actually getting into the weeds of those conversations where then a real answer can emerge. And so for coaches or for other folks who just jump in and say, okay, we're going to give this person the power, it's actually a disservice. It's not teaching them how to fish. And so my job's actually to work on this emotional component and get everyone realigned there, because then the business decision becomes infinitely easier and clearer.
That's a great point. And so that speaks to like a common myth of decision making, who makes the decision is solved through equity allocation. And then so long as that has been determined, then everyone understands their order in the hierarchy and the problems are solved. Clearly not the case. That's not that simple. So what other myths? And let's speak not only for the co-founders, but also for the investors who might listen to this. Like, what are the other common myths around co-founder conflict that we should be aware of and anticipate?
I think there's maybe two other ones that come to mind. One is this myth that co-founder conflict can be avoided through a perfect partnership. And I think, again, directionally correct in the sense of trying to prioritize more of this co-founder selection process, like this dating period of really getting to know one another and doing some collaborative work, asking each other a lot of really important questions and working through some of these power and other types of issues early. All of these things are directionally right and very important to do because in contrast to a marriage, say, there's not that same level of dating, commitment, understanding that's being shared and built. However, I think where it misses the mark is, again, this myth that the conflict altogether can be avoided. And in fact, like I was saying, without conflict, you're not making the most effective decisions. You're not growing as a team. And that avoidance is what's going to really be to your detriment. And so there's no such thing as a perfect match. All matches will have conflict. And it's really about how you navigate it. And that's where I wish the language was more focused on. Because a lot of, and even founders do this too, retroactively, they will have hindsight bias. They will look and say, oh, we weren't good personality matches. Well, look, you can't have your mirror image. And even if you did, that would not be successful for the company. It's not in the company's best interest. It's actually, diverse perspectives that lead to the best outcome. And so I think it's really important to say that that's, again, oversimplifying that really, and I think it denies responsibility and ownership over your contribution to dysfunction. So my whole thing is let's focus less on finding the perfect match, even though that's important. And let's focus more on building the skills, language, and resources to navigate these conflicts if and when they arise.
Yeah. Same as in a relationship. There's no perfect person. They're not going to meet all your needs. You're not going to meet all theirs. It's not going to work in that way. Well, let's talk about a little bit about how do co-founders determine when it's just not going to work and when the right thing to do is to walk away from each other?
This is one of the more difficult topics. So I've worked with teams who are kind of in this state of ambivalence and not sure. And I've been pulled in by a lot of coaches to like jump in at the moment where they know it's headed for some kind of exit. And my job is to kind of help us avoid litigation and make sure that goes smoothly. And in both scenarios, my approach is roughly similar, which is usually what I see at that time are some kind of telltale signs that things are not going well, such as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which are, contempt, stonewalling, defensiveness, criticism. And so I see some of those signs that are signals that something is really wrong in the partnership, that trust has gone down. There's that negative attribution happening. There's a lack of vulnerability and that things are not headed in a positive direction. In addition to those, which are pretty persistent, where teams end up making the choice to separate is in noticing a lack of competence and or there's a lack of commitment to making it work. And so if there's teams who just have some of those issues, we can work on that if they're highly committed. And so my approach generally, getting back to what I was saying, my approach generally is to focus on some of these interpersonal things, to clear that field, to make the business decision even clearer and more decisive. And so as an example, I'm working with a team right now where we've worked over the last couple of months to really make meaningful progress in terms of their trust, in terms of their ability to communicate. And now it's very clear that there's actually a competence issue. And that's going to have to be addressed in this other way. And so now we're going to move that direction and then work to kind of decouple. And then in other teams, there's just a point at which there's the presence of these things that are dysfunctional. The patterns are consistent. And there's a decision that I no longer am committed to making this work. And so that's whenever we will call it.
Okay. So that's an important takeaway. It's like the competency stuff can be sort of wrapped up in actually the interpersonal conflict, the ships sailing past each other in the night. And step number 1 is reconcile that. And then if the competency issue presents itself clearly after that, maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but I would interpret a competency issue as a classic scenario where the company has sort of outgrown the founder, so to speak, or one of the co-founders. It's just Maybe you have this technical co-founder, amazing, laid the foundation for the technology, but then it's at a point where it places a different set of needs on that co-founder. So maybe that person decides to fall back into the CTO role, manages the technology, and maybe that's a healthy way instead of departing from the company, departing from the leadership role in that co-founder sense and falling back into their strength.
Yeah, and I would love to jump in because I love how you articulated that. And it's a really important point that from my bias as a psychologist is that focusing on the interpersonal and clearing that first does really clarify what needs to happen in the business sense. Because I think whenever you skip it, if you just go and try to restructure and layer in this individual, the interpersonal issues, those power dynamics, the need for recognition, all of that still exists and it still has not been addressed. And so it's still going to influence not only this pair, but also the other employees. And so that's where it can be really dangerous to think that if you just solve the business thing or you just restructure or you just make this exit, that will somehow fix the problem. It actually freezes it. It just takes a slightly different form. It's kind of like advanced triangulation. You just move the problem a little bit further away, but the conflict still is present. And so that's why, to your point, I really like to focus on those interpersonal dynamics first and then go to the business. And this is simultaneous, but I think thinking about these as separate, I think is helpful.
How much of this then for a co-founder is really about developing the skills so that they can premeditate and get ahead of these issues versus allowing them to make these mistakes and then through the process of needing to correct them, really truly learn about sort of how to develop those skills. Like if you were to say, actually, I want people to skate ahead and get ahead of it versus, well, sometimes you just got to face plant, and that's actually where the true learning is going to happen. Like it's an impossible line in the sand, of course, but how do you think about that?
I would love more preventative work here. And part of what's been fascinating to me is I was on a retreat that VCs put on for their portfolio companies, and I was running a co-founder track that was specific to helping co-founders improve all these things we've been talking about. What I found fascinating was that several of the green first-time founders had attitudes like, oh, yeah, this isn't that important. Like, yeah, we know it's important. We've heard the statistic and 65% of high potential startup failure to co-founder conflict. We've heard these things, but that's not going to happen to us. We're fine. We don't have any conflict. We talk about things openly. And it's fascinating. I actually had a team that were kind of afraid to even have an imaginary conflict conversation with these skills I was implementing because they thought that would create a problem where there isn't one. And this is the same old adage that comes up whenever you're being trained as a therapist. This is for, people who are inexperienced and other things. They're like, oh my gosh, if I ask a patient about suicide, I'm planting the idea in their head and then they're going to go kill themselves. In fact, the research shows that is not at all factual. They were already thinking about it. And if they were going to do it, it has nothing to do with you asking the question. And so similarly with conflict, I think there is so much more preparatory work that could be done that would be exceptionally beneficial that would help you scale faster. And I would love to move more to that model. And I think the good news is as I think about this space in general, I'm seeing more investment in founder mental health and entrepreneur mental health broadly. There was this massive boom of coaching and other sort of wellness from a corporate POV a few years ago. And I think it's starting to shift and we're starting to understand the unique challenges of entrepreneurs. And so I think there's going to be more investment and not just the beautiful words of, oh, I'm pro founder mental health, but actually money backing it up. And I think that gives us more of an opportunity to create more preventative programs. And I would love to do a pilot and measure the outcomes and track teams over time. This would be fascinating. But I would love to move more in that direction. But the good news is, to your point, you are going to fall on your face. You're going to have problems. It's just a matter of when. And so do you have the skills and are you ready to catch that and not hit as low of a low? Or is it going to be that rude awakening and wake up call? Time will tell.
When you were saying that, it brought two independent studies that I read, unrelated to this, but I think related to this. I read one study that asked the question of, when high-performing students go off to a good college, some sink, some swim. Why is that the case? Is it because there actually happens to be this leap, this intellectual leap that happens and they're not smart enough, or is it something else? And the way that they ran the study was they looked at the language that was used when reinforcing the students' abilities from their own families. So for example, let's say I'm a straight A kid in high school and my parents are using the language of, you're just so smart, you just have this gift, versus some parents who use the language of, you put in a lot of effort, you work so hard, you're diligent. And then there was this mapping of sort of these different categories of language. One category of language was really about you're succeeding because you have this intrinsic ability, versus this other category of language was you're succeeding because of the effort you put in. And then when you look at these dual tracks of these kids that went off to university, then when they encountered that first stumble, like I remember I'd taken a calculus class in college and getting like a D. I was like, oh shit, like this isn't good. I've never had a B, let alone a D. And there were dozens of kids that walked out of that lecture crying, just like me, a bunch of valedictorians or whatever, just in shambles. And so it was this sort of sink or swim thing. And what they found was that the students who were brought up within this language of constructionism, like you are a good student because you put in the effort, you rebound yourself. What they did was then sort of shifted their effort, shifted their way of studying, put in more effort, and then they were able to sustain themselves, rebound, and improve. The other kids who were brought up within the language of intrinsic ability, they then interpreted this bad test as like, I'm just not smart enough, I guess. And then from there, their confidence and everything just completely collapsed. And then the shifts in behaviors that might improve their odds of getting a good grade, it just didn't happen. And so that was one study. And then completely unrelated, I read a similarly structured study about marriages. And it was basically the same finding of like the couples that had this language of we're soulmates, this was preordained, we were destined to be together, their chances of divorce were much, much higher than the couples who used the language of we built this relationship, we worked on this relationship, we improved it through effort. Because the takeaway is basically like you're married, there's shit's going to hit the fan at some point. You're going to have real troubles, real conflict, whether you see it coming or not. And so if your psychology is rooted around, oh, this was meant to be, and then you hit a rough patch in the road, then you decide, well, I guess I was wrong about that. I misinterpreted the signals. We weren't meant to be together. Therefore, you just split and fall apart. And then for the other couples where they had this language of we worked on it, we built it, we made it happen. Then when shit hit the fan, what did they do? They got to work on the relationship, and their probability of sustaining it much longer was way higher. All of this just made me think of those two studies and how common it was and similar. And to tie it into your point of like, that would suggest, assuming there's the same fundamental dynamics there of like, if you invest early on in this mentality, in this language of like, we can build a really good co-founding partnership, I have to imagine that carries the relationship further than those that don't.
It's a great point. I mean, you're talking about an internal or external locus of control. And so if you just say, oh, we're a good match. Oh, we're a perfect match. Oh, we have complementary skill sets, right? That's an external locus of control. Whereas if you say, oh, we're going to work really hard and to continue improving our communication and making sure that we're making the best decisions that we can, and we're going to invest time and energy into this, then to your point, I guess it makes more sense that then those teams who do that would be able to call upon those resources more readily than the teams who are used to placing themselves as these passive objects that are, being done to.
Yeah. I guess what it makes me think is, and I look back at some of the co-founding relationships I've seen fall apart, like the signals were there early where one of the co-founders clearly didn't have this sort of constructionist mentality, and another one did. And eventually it blew up. Basically, one was willing to work on it and the other was not. Well, a question for you about the future, and we sort of hinted this earlier. Where do you see the direction of coaching going?
Well, one, I'm going to continue to advocate for co-founder coaching as an emerging category. And I guess, let me just say something about that. I view the co-founding relationship and partnership as the highest leverage relationship in the company. And I mean that because part of what, my clinical research has been showing me is that where this relationship is strong, there's increased resilience to these external stressors. There's more trust, less loneliness, which entrepreneur research shows entrepreneurs are more likely to be lonely than not. And so it actually can create this buffer and this isolation from many of the different difficulties of building and scaling a company. And whenever things are not going well, of course, it can lead to really painful and difficult outcomes where the work impacts personal stuff impacts work, and just everything starts to spiral. And so my hope is that co-founder coaching starts taking a more active role and a more prominent role in the space, and that it's understood as something that should be the default setting for most teams. To your point, preventatively start these conversations early before issues arise, and certainly is to become a well-known resource as things start to go off the rails a little bit, as is expected in this entrepreneurial journey. So I'd love to see co-founder coaching be even more prominent. I also think there's going to be more of a push, my guess, is for things to be more holistic. And so I was kind of saying that team-based approach earlier with an individual therapist, co-founder coach, an exec coach, peer group. And so I think there are going to be bigger companies coming in and trying to do more of that and partnering with VCs and other sorts of things, which I think will be a net positive. I just also know that often as things try to grow and scale like that, then the quality of the clinician starts to decrease. And so the outcomes aren't going to be as positive. But yeah, there's different models for how to make this work. And my hope is just that there's more involvement, more collaboration. Because the other thing that I'll say is that I've noticed to be very interesting is whenever I've dealt with a team who's going through high conflict and I've spoken with one or more of their investors, I've learned a little bit and I've been able to even be more effective. It's very interesting because we all have different perspectives and lenses on what the core problem is. And so I was able to talk to some investors and they gave me like the business issue from their perspective. And that was actually really impactful for how I then intervened with the team because they had a different perspective and insight than I did. And so I think there's a model where actually some more collaboration could be really helpful. Of course, that would require venture capital to be more open to mental health broadly, and that's its own battle. And I also think there's all sorts of economics challenges with investing in mental health. And there's also like the implications for what this means for future rounds of funding. So it does get very complex. My hope is that the entire ecosystem, though, can be more open to prioritizing mental health.
Yeah, I actually think that tripartite form would be very interesting because, on the investor side, it's very simple. And this is not a judgment against them. This is the job that they do. Their job is to maximize profit. And they're attempting to maximize profit in many cases for foundations and endowment and causes that can benefit humanity. At the venture firm that I was a part of, we had many foundations and endowments that were RLPs, where they were conducting research on serious illnesses for children. Or the university endowments in general is like, if we generate a profit for them, that boosts the endowment, which they can then use to offset the cost of education for low-income families. That's one very specific profit motive that at times can run in real conflict with what founders believe is necessary. And I can see it being a very hard thing to negotiate, bringing in those different perspectives and somehow finding a way to move forward through that versus what happens now is like, I've seen this time and time again, co-founders have one objective in mind. The investor is then driven by this other objective. And then instead of any attempt at negotiation, it's an angry couple of phone calls or emails. It blows up. And then it's like, okay, you don't talk to me. We don't talk to you. We're not doing our pro rata. Good luck. Right. And then subsequent financing terms then include terms that punish any investors that don't do their pro rata. And then it's sort of weaponizing fundraising rounds as an assault. And man, that is ugly. It's unenjoyable to be a part of. I have to imagine that there's a better way of moving through that.
I agree. And I think, again, like these differences in perspective, they at times can be oppositional. So I talk to teams a lot about how they manage their boards and how that impacts their team dynamic and all sorts of things. And when both parties are open to and have the ability to talk about those differences, again, it can flow much better and the relationships can be preserved. It doesn't have to have such a negative tone. And I wish, again, that could be more of the direction that people went in, because each perspective has merit, has value. And sometimes more information leads to better outcomes and better decision-making than, to your point, walling off and then not talking and having a lot of hostility.
And just to second your point of, kind of having this team, that's what I'd say to founders is you are attempting to do something extremely difficult. And think of yourself as if you were a college athlete or a professional athlete. You're going to put yourself through something that is going to test you mentally and physically. And as an athlete, it's common at this point. We know this is like you have a holistic model of care around the athlete. You have the nutritionist, you have the person that works on aches and pains, you have the strength and conditioning coach. They don't look at an athlete and say, well, if they're a great enough athlete, they'll just figure it out and make it happen. Right? They clearly know that model is outdated. It doesn't work. You have to surround the athlete with all these tools and resources for developing them, but also allowing rest and recovery and rehabilitation. And so I'm certainly in favor of beginning it with Series A, because I think the math just checks out at that point. You raise a $6 to $10 million round. And if you can carve out, call it $5,000 a month to provide that toolkit, that seems like an asymmetric upside investment into the founders. And if you keep them healthy and happy and make them more efficient, productive, the benefits that the business will yield from that couple $1,000 a month investment will easily pay itself off. So that's just my personal pitch, whoever's listening to this.
You're speaking my language.
Well, hey, Dr. Jones, it's been awesome. Thank you for sharing your insights and allowing me to ask some of the harder questions. I think everyone's going to get a lot of benefit from this. And I look forward to having future conversations, because I'm sure, I'm going to have a whole other set of questions where I'll want to do a second sort of deep dive into the same subject. For now, thank you for spending the time with me.
Yeah, thanks. This was a lot of fun.